Hey guys, thanks for checking out my post-game thoughts video of the battle report that you probably just watched, where I took on JP, one of my local players, and his invincible army, although they were defeated this time. So one of the things I like to talk about right now is the army list that I chose and the army list that JP chose. Both of these lists were built for acquisition. Mine is meant to play with acquisition and power pack. Or no, I'm sorry. Yeah, acquisition and power pack. I don't know if JP's list was meant to play on their missions or not. I have no idea. So the list I played is the one I've been playing in a couple other games. It's very similar to the other lists that I'll be taking to LVO. I really like having similar lists in multiple list events. That's something that I would usually do in War Machine, which is another multiple list game if you're not familiar. Just because when you're playing in a large event, so if you're playing in a 5-round or more event, it's very taxing both mentally and physically to keep going. So in my opinion, the more similarities that you have between your two lists, the kind of easier it is to free up, mental cycles or whatever you want to call it for other things. So the list is built for those two missions. It has a lot of specialists. I have the Kamel White Hacker in there to get the +3 willpower for the Xenotech Beacon, because only having a 55%er to drop that can be pretty problematic. That's usually something I want to get done on the first turn. So anything that kind of buys me some more success with that is something that I want to grab. Overall, the Kamel with a white hacking device I don't think is a particularly good model. I think it's way overpriced. It doesn't have any good hacking programs that are useful for really any Toha lists, unless you're taking the Toha tag, which I don't like. It's really just in the mission so that it can be a data tracker for acquisition, and so that it makes the Xenotech easier to do on acquisition. That's pretty much it. Everything else is pretty forward for actually doing the mission. I have the Rasail and the Coattail as my individual Rambo pieces, with the Coattail being a forward observer in the list. And then I have my kind of do-it-all triad of the Gaurel, Sukiel, and McCall, also with a backup McCall. So they can get where they need to go. They can push buttons. They can challenge pretty much anything in the game as far as a firefight goes, because if I'm just trying to do normal firefight, the Gaurel is my go-to because MSV2, and he has a Spitfire and a Triad, very good. And then the Sukiel is kind of the big stuff killer, as you probably saw in the game. He's killing tags, killing heavy infantry with the K1 combi, and all that kind of good stuff. So the list worked out really well in the mission. I could have definitely played it a little bit better, which we'll get into in a minute, in some areas. But as far as actually bringing the tools to the table, I was happy with the tools that I brought. The only thing that I'm probably going to change, and actually have changed as of recording this, is the Krakot is going to get turned into just another McCall, because I think having a Krakot in these two missions is not as good as they normally are. I really like the Krakots because they often get 6-4 and then some kind of movement ability, either super jump or climbing plus. So they're really good at chasing things down and recovering stuff, or doing whatever you need to do. But in acquisition and power pack, you don't have as much of a need for a role like that. So I wanted to kind of instead have another insurance blanket of being able to have Eclipse Smoke, because that makes the list just so much easier to play when you have access to smoke, as it does for really any army. And then I kind of retain that same combat presence if someone comes to me, not as much projecting. And then I have a similar ARO piece. They both just shoot big templates, and that's kind of their thing. So it's not a huge change, but it's just the fact that looking at the two missions, I didn't think the Krakot would be as useful for his niche role as having another McCall would be. So that's the only real change that I made, and everything else I was pretty happy with. As far as JP's armies go, or JP's list goes, I'm going to say that I don't know any army except for Toha all that well, so take everything I'm going to say with a grain of salt. But I didn't love the Fireteam core that much. It seemed like it was taking up a lot of space. While it's not very expensive, and I'm talking about space in the combat group, while it's not a very expensive fire team, because it's mostly just line troopers, one line trooper being a paramedic, and then one mid price guy with a multispectral visor, taking up 5 slots in what is effectively a 10 slot faction, because most people seem to be playing Invincible Army as one combat group, which I think they do very, very well in and have a lot of advantages doing that kind of build. You only have 5 more models to play with. And as was kind of shown in the game, there was really only 2 forward models that JP's list had, which was the Moang being the big one, and then the Hulang being the other. The Moang is pretty tough. The Hulang is reasonably tough, but not particularly hard to remove. So if those models die, or if they get entangled, or something, the list has a problem projecting force, and that's kind of what happened in the game. Is JP's build incentivizes sitting back with these kind of arrow power pieces, but if you can get through that either with smoke and getting rid of the hideout, with eclipse smoke, with just kind of scurrying around the edges and things like that, his list really suffers. So like the Yanho in the game we played didn't do anything. It took an arrow that I gave it with the coattail, but that was it. And that's a very expensive model to not be getting really any work out of, other than forcing your opponent to throw 1 smoke a turn. I don't think that's enough for how many points that model costs, how much SWC it costs, and all that kind of good stuff. So while I like a lot of the pieces of the list, I like the Moang, I like the Zensha, they're great. Hulangs are great. The Dao Ying is a fantastic lieutenant, probably one of the better ones in the game, especially for their price. I don't know if I loved the fire team as much, and I might prefer to see it convert to something that's a little bit more like a normal fire team, where you have a couple guys in there who are an offensive threat, and then you can double them as an ARO threat, because it's a big team. You get +3 ballistic, or +3 BS, an extra shot, 6 sense level 2, all that kind of good stuff. Pretty much anybody in a fire team core is a reasonable ARO piece. So I might even take a look at dropping the Yanho and to make some of that happen. I don't hate the Yanho as a model. It's a very scary ARO piece with the profile that was taken, but it's just really expensive, and it's not particularly mobile. It's only a 4/2. It doesn't have any kind of like movement skills or anything like that. And that was sort of what happened in the game. Is it got parked on a rooftop, which when you're deploying looks great, because you're gonna do a bunch of damage, or project a bunch of force in ARO, I should say. But I was able to play around that to the point where the model was not so effective. So those are some possible small tweaks. Again, I don't claim to be an expert when it comes to Invincible Army. Don't kill me if that's your faction. Those are just my initial thoughts on the game. So with that being said, we're going to go into some of the things that I thought were a little some game changers, I guess. So we'll have a look at deployment first, because I think that's a hugely not utilized, but underappreciated part of the game. I think it's probably the most important part of the game, similar to some other games I've played in the past. And then we'll touch on a couple other things as well, but deployment is mainly what I want to talk about. All right, we're back in after some camera trickery. So pulled up here is I have the best shot I have of what I wanted to talk about, and what I think was a big point in the game, which is JP's deployment. So I don't have these photos like pre-affected or anything like that, so sorry if I'm jumping around a little bit. I'll try to give you some warning in case people get like motion sick or anything like that from me jumping around slides. But this is the first one. So we're looking at it from JP's perspective. So he's deployed in his right-hand corner, my left-hand flank, and he has the Yanho and the Hideout. And now, as I said at the beginning of the actual battle report, they are both kind of occupying this lane of fire. They're all over the tech coffin and the middle in general. So if I step out, I'm going to have to use smoke or something else like that. This, I think, was a pretty big mistake in deployment on JP's side, and that's because I think he overcommitted to trying to lock down one part of the board. So he has a model with neurocynetics and 2 missile launchers, as well as a pretty elite multi-sniper in a 5-man team, both overlooking the same area. Now, it is good to layer arrows because it can make your opponent play in a different way, or it can, cut off options and things like that. But that's not 100% what was going on here. So let's take my army out of the equation for a second, and let's just say this is the deployment into whatever. No matter what JP was going to play against, he was going to deploy like this. I don't know if that's true or not. We're doing a thought experiment. So if anything walks out, it's probably going to die because it's very difficult to go toe-to-toe with the models that I talked about for the reasons I already spoke about. If you have smoke, which most armies do, especially competitively built ones, if their faction has access to it, then you're taking the missile launcher out of the equation. He doesn't have any MSV or anything like that. He's not doing anything. So then you're just having to worry about the high Dow, which is a good model. It's reasonably tough. The MSV2 obviously will see through regular smoke and things like that. So she'll always kind of be there. But in the active turn, it's not that unreasonable for your opponent to have a model that can go toe to toe with the hideout, even when it's in a 5-man fire team. They're going to be able to stack, some weird mods, or they'll just have good burst, or they can deliver maybe a model that gets a little bit closer, where the sniper rifle won't have as good of, will have a bad range band, things like that. There's going to be some way to circumvent it. And I think when you're placing an arrow, if you can't handle smoke with all of the models that are locking down one area, it's not as powerful, because getting smoke down is not very hard. You're usually going to be putting it on warband models who have good physique to begin with, 12, 13, 14, and then they're probably going to be within 8, so now we're on 15, 16, 17. It's not really going to eat up that much of their orders to do that. And then if they manage to kill the high Dow or something like that, then the list kind of falls apart. So what I would have liked to have seen, or what I would have done if I was in JP's plays, especially deploying first and blind, don't look at the screen for a second if you freak out when pictures move around. But going back to here, I probably would have placed it either on this building or on this building. Now, the second building isn't as attractive because there's not really any cover on there, although you can use the, you're above me, so you have cover thing. We probably should have placed some scatter on there. I generally like to play with buildings that all have at least one, little thing on them that you can hide on or hide behind to get cover. But what that would have done is it still keeps a very dominating ARO position, because the hideout is still, seeing all of this, which is a lot. That's a lot of the table, especially for a not trivial model to remove. But then the Yonho gets to cover either all of this. Obviously there's gaps in here because there's buildings and stuff, but it's just getting it from another angle. So it would be okay, I have a missile launcher scene here, and I have a multi-sniper scene here. Still gets the effect of locking down the center very well, but it does it from multiple angles. So if you think back to the battle report, I had a problem dealing with the Moang when it was, right about here, seen this way. So if there's the Moang going there, which it could have because JP went first, and another model backing it up from this position, and a model backing it up from this position, that's a very hard puzzle for me to solve. That's going to take multiple smoke orders, or, I'm going to have to give up some AROs. Something like that is going to change in the game, which makes it much harder for me to just do what I want. As it was, I only have one angle of approach that I have to worry about from the enemy army, so I just lock that down, and the rest of the table is my playing field. Another good thing about placing the model there is it would have given JP some ARO on both consoles, so he wouldn't, because the far right one, from my perspective, was pretty open. So once I was able to cross the middle with the smoke, I don't really have to worry about anything anymore. And I think that's something that you do have to think and worry about when you're playing a list with so few models, because you don't have as many bodies to lock down all these angles of approach and things like that as most lists would. So, because, most armies are probably on, between 13, 15 models, something like that, just ballparking it. Whereas he's, of course, on 10, and they're all pretty important. So, I think that's definitely what I would prefer to see, and that would have changed the game a lot. I wouldn't have been able to approach as easily. The mission would have been much harder. I wouldn't have been able to kill the Moang so easily. All that kind of stuff. That would have been a really good deployment on JP's part. Excuse me. So that was the thing that I definitely would have changed if I was in his position for deployment. As far as my deployment goes, I was pretty happy with it overall, but as was kind of made obvious in the battle report, Krak got way too forward. I didn't need to place him forward because, like I said, he's not a specialist. And there's really nothing for him to chase down in this list. It's not like we're playing like supplies or something like that where you're grabbing stuff and running away. Nothing like that. So he should have probably been, more like back here or something like that. Not on the super back line, but back far enough where that he can be prone and very safe and then get himself involved when he needs to. And the reason that's such a big deal is because let's say I did deploy him there, correctly. We're assuming the same game. We're not kind of following the train of thought of JP doing the different deployment like I spoke about. That's its own thing. But when the Hu Lang kind of starts making his murder train come along this way, it's just another model that he has to deal with. So the more models that I can put in the way of an enemy model going like Rambo on me or something, just kind of either disincentivizes that line of play or just makes it that much more risky because the model could easily die before you get to do with it what you want, which ultimately was to deliver it to here so that he could start flamethrower and stuff. So that would have been a fairly good play for me as far as deployment goes. And then some of the other deployment things were just not having facings correct. So like this Kaltar right here. Again, as the Hu Lang is approaching and going all throughout here, he's just seen him for days. Would get at least 2 AROs as he's moving through, probably more than that. But because I don't have his arcs that well, distinguished, and he's seen like this, oops, can't see. So that's another deployment mistake for me. Just a really basic one, but that's something I need to pay more attention to, and anybody should pay attention to, is making sure that your models are locking down the avenues that you want them to. Because I don't really care if the Moang, flanks out like this. It's going to take him a while to get over there. He can't see the Chaxa because it's prone. He can see the Rasail, but it's going to take him a while to kill the Rasail just because of how many wounds it has and all that kind of stuff. And then there's not really there's no cover over here for him to engage the Rasail on. So he's going to be out of cover, and then, things get dicier even though he's in the active turn. So I don't really think that's something he would have gone for. And in fact, just looking at this in the moment, there was really no reason for this Chaxa to be here. And it probably should have been, deployed more on top of the Rasail, because there's not that many templates in JP's army, and I don't really mind if the Chaxa gets clipped by a template. It's a free model, so if I can double ARO something that's shooting both of them, so much the better. So I could have easily made it so that the right hand is off limits, and then the Moang isn't really getting much done because it's probably just gonna walk up here, do the beacon thing like it did, and then where is it going? Is it just going to rush into the middle? Because then you're coming in the center of my army, you don't have a ton of orders, and you need to get other things done. Probably not making it out alive. Definitely not making it out alive on my next turn. And then, he could post up where he did. We saw what happened with that. Or he just kind of retreats to a more back position, which is not the worst play, but it's, again, taking a pretty expensive model and not really getting a ton of work out of it. And then even if that does happen, I can smoke up the center and then just go around and kill him. So with some better deployments by me, I think I would have taken a lot less casualties and really made it so that JP feel like he didn't have any lines of play, which is what you should always try to do, because the more options you take away from your opponent, the better. So those are just some of the deployment things. Everything else was fine. I'm not extremely mad at it or anything like that. One of the mistakes I made during deployment was not asking JP how many models he had placed, which was obviously 9, and then he had 1 reserved. The reason that matters is because the Lu Jing drop trooper for Invincibles is super good. He's in a lot of lists that I see online and in person. So I was placing a lot of these models in a way so that I'm kind of denying like easy landing zones. So like this Chaxa is, blocking off a lot of this. All of this stuff in the center is blocking off that angle, and then I'm going to move backwards here. So, and then I have this Kael'tar who's blocking a lot of this space. This Chaxa is blocking this way. This Chaxa is blocking here. So it makes it very risky for him to just drop a drop trooper in the midst of my lines. Now, if I'd asked how many models he deployed and he says 9, it's unlikely that he keeps back a drop trooper as a reserve model. It's not impossible. And in a 10 model list, it's not the worst play either, but I think there's better models to do it with, like the Moang and the Hulang. Both of their positions matter so much that I think that they would be the more likely reserve model in that instance. So I could have made a read and deployed more clumped up because I didn't have to worry about the drop trooper, and then that would have made it a little bit easier to deal with the Hulang coming at me and stuff like that. So that's just a mental thing where I wasn't asking the right questions. Like I said, that knowing that he deployed 9 models and has 1 in reserve does not guarantee that there is no drop trooper, but it gives me some information to make an educated guess, and I probably would have guessed that there isn't one. So that's just that's a smaller mistake, but it's something that I need to be aware of in games going forward. The deployment was where I think most of the game really swung because, like I said, I didn't have to fight my way into the scenario, if that makes sense. It was just there for the taking. Going second is just such a big advantage in this mission, which is one of the reasons I like Acquisition. I think it balances going first and going second very well, whereas some missions don't. That I didn't have to be the aggressor or anything like that, which is usually the position that you want to put your opponent in when you go first, because you want them to... You're taking, pieces of the table, you're taking some of the mission stuff, whatever mission you might be playing, and so you're putting your opponent at an early deficit, and they have to fight back to make up that deficit and to stay in the game. After JP's turn 1, I did not feel like I was in a deficit. Sure, I lost a couple models. I lost the Krakot to my own stupidity, and I lost the Liberto and his mine. But the Liberto and the mine took a bunch of orders. The mine got shot once and was discovered, so that's 2. The Liberto was discovered and then shot twice. So that's 5 orders for a list that has 12 orders. That's a huge deal. Like I'll trade that all the time. That was 24 points of my army that I lost to effectively give my opponent not a turn 1. That's pretty good. So I would have been fine with that. Losing the Krakot was bad, but everything else was fine. So, and then from there, only 1 console was taken. I had a model in position to already counter that. All that kind of stuff. Like the HVTs weren't under any kind of pressure. There wasn't a big presence in the middle that was coming at me. There was a projected presence, but not actual models there or anything like that other than the Zensha. So I was looking at the table. I was like, well, I can kind of just chill out and I don't have to fight. I can just, take these little fights that I need to kind of clear things out. And then on turn 2 and 3, I'm just going to make a dash for the objectives, and it's going to be very hard to stop me. And that's exactly what happened. So then the last thing I want to talk about, which I guess I could just leave this slide up. It's fine. It's not a big deal. Is the mission itself. So if I had the choice, I would almost always want to go second in Acquisition, because you have such a huge advantage as the second player in the mission as far as winning it. The first player has to do a lot of work to negate that advantage by, alpha striking you or things like that. And then because Toha is such a great defensive army, they ARO very well, which I've written blog posts about in the past and things like that, that I don't really have any fear of going second. Possibly to the point where if I won the lieutenant role, I might choose to go second. Normally that's a really bad idea, because if you're going second and have to deploy first, it can be hard to kind of keep things in front of you and all that. But depending on the faction that I was going against and the table, I wouldn't feel uncomfortable with it. there's kind of a natural desire amongst most people, excuse me, to just go first because it feels good to go first. You get to be the first person to move around, to take fights and things like that. So you kind of set the tone for the game. But there needs to be some awareness on if your list is good at going first. I wouldn't say JP's list was particularly good at going first. He does have those two models, the Hulang and the Moang, that are very good at rushing and getting work done. The Moang being fantastic at it, the Hulang just being good at it. But I don't know if that's enough to really kind of push everything into the middle of the table, so to speak, and on first turn. The list that JP was playing does not have that many orders in it compared to even a normal list. Even though there's NCO and all that kind of stuff getting up to 12, normal lists have a little bit more than that. And none of the models that he was rushing me with are particularly fast or anything like that. So the Moang is just 4/4, and the Hulang is just 4/4. So they are going to need to use some orders. Like positioning and all that kind of stuff as they move along, so they don't get into unsafe situations. So it's really hard for there to be kind of like a turn one murder train the way that there would be if you're playing like a more offensively oriented Link, or if you're playing like one of the Rems that likes to go fight, because those are 6/4 and they usually have some kind of movement ability. So there just wasn't anything in there that I was particularly worried about rushing down my entire list on turn one. Not every list needs something like that. Not every list has something like that. But I think it required a little bit more awareness of what was going on. If I was playing this Invincible list and I'm looking at it, it's obvious that it's a very strong defensive list because of the two big ARO pieces, and then you also have some pieces you can put into suppressive fire at no cost, really, and that are very good at it. So I would have been like, I'm going to take it on the chin. I'm playing Invincibles. A lot of my stuff that I put forward is very tough as far as like armor and wounds go and all that. I have good ARO pieces. If I can weather on turn one, then I'll be fine, because you can't put anything in suppressive fire before you get the chance to go, obviously. So that's when you're weakest. But just with all the other things that he still had and the durability, I think that it would have been fine, especially because my list is not very rushdown oriented either. Obviously, JP did not have a way to know that going into the game, but in general, I don't feel like Toha is a particularly rushy faction. Obviously, you can put together a lot of different triads and be efficient with your movement and stuff like that, but I just don't feel like they're as good at it as some other factions. So I think if I won the lieutenant role in JP's place, I would have chosen to go second, which plays more to my army strengths and plays to the mission itself. So that was another big piece of why the game went the way that it did, is because I got to go second, and then the combination of having that last say on the mission and not having to deal with stuff getting up in my face and all the time made for a pretty easy game for me to navigate and come out with a good sized win. Not to say I didn't make any mistakes, as I've already gone over, but it was pretty simple to formulate what I wanted to do that game and then execute it. The game Infinity feels very good when your game plan does not revolve around killing your opponent's models. It feels very good when you only have to kill a couple of pieces to free things up, and then you're kind of just biding your time, and then you're going to make a scenario push. It's one of the reasons I love going second, and almost all the time. Some missions are bad for that, but most are good. So that was basically just what happened this game. Is I got to sit back, not make any risky plays or anything like that, and just kind of deal with a couple of these pieces that I knew were going to come for me. And then once that was done, even if JP had used his second turn to develop the fire team and things like that, instead of dumping all the orders into the Hulang, I just don't really know how much work he would have gotten done, especially with a fire team that is so focused on doing one thing, which is shooting from really far away. It's not like there's a boarding shotgun guy or like a Spitfire guy or anything like that in the Link team to supplement when the sniper isn't, when it's not his time, when it's time to get up and close and do some things. At that point, you're just banking on your line troopers, which is, even with the fire team bonuses, it's hard to go on a real run with them, especially when they're just armed with combi rifles. So a combination of many things made it so that I just never really felt threatened. And when you don't feel threatened, it's really easy to win in the game, unless you're just making bad reads the whole time and stuff like that. So that's most of what I have to say about the game. Not really going to go on for much longer. So the highlights are, deployment was a big deal. Turn order, really big deal, and then some of the small things that happen in the game. So I do feel like, to a large extent, the game was decided before we actually even started playing. Just on deployment and being able to go second, I felt hugely advantaged right off of the bat, and then that turned into a pretty big and pretty easy victory for me as well. So those are my main takeaways from this game, and hopefully you guys enjoyed listening to me ramble about it. Like I said, I'll be back probably very late this week with another video, and we'll see how that one goes. But thanks for watching.